out there in Bourbon Real Talk land. Randy Sullivan coming to you today with a very special episode. You asked for it, you got it. We are going to discuss the difference between a column still and a pot still. Now, first off, I have to apologize because we are filming on location at a distillery, and we are in a pole barn, an actual pole barn, and there's doors, and there's wind, and so it's blowing, and it's kind of loud, so I apologize about that. But I want to introduce my guest. This is Phillip with Treaty Oak Distilling, and you are the Director of Product Development?
Yep, Director of Product Development. I take care of all the quality assurance, how we make the bourbon and the gin, as well as new products like our bottled old fashioned, other things of that like.
Ah, so you are working some ready-to-drink cocktails and that kind of thing?
That's the way of the world right now.
The way of the world, RTDs, woo!
But there's a little bit for everybody.
That's awesome, that's awesome. So Treaty Oak has some really amazing products, but one of the interesting things about Treaty Oak is that you have both a column still and pot stills here at the distillery, and you oversee those being used. So let's start off kind of from a technical level and from a functional level. Let's talk about the difference between how a column still works and how a pot still works.
Yeah, so chemically they are going through the same practice and the same concept. So basically, if you have beer, which is all the grains, the corn, the wheat, the barley that has been fermented to create the alcohol, and when you introduce heat to that, you get separation because alcohol is a lighter molecule than water. So with that ethanol and all the congeners and other ingredients that make up what we know and love about bourbon will be separated from that water. Mm-hmm. So pot stills and column stills both use that concept. But the difference, as the name suggests, if it's a column still, it's a continuous distillation. So you have a beer well, which has that beer in it, and it is continuously throughout the entire run being pumped into the still, and then it cascades
into the top, right?
It goes right into the top, and it cascades down a series of perforated plates, and we have steam coming up from the bottom, and so they meet and they find their equilibrium, and all of the ethanol is stripped out of that liquid, and the liquid drops to the bottom, gets pumped out, and then the ethanol goes all the way through the top and into the doubler, which is a secondary pot still. Mm-hmm. And that's where it gets cleaned and purified, and it's made of copper, so you pull out a lot of the sulfites, mm-hmm. and that is what becomes your unaged whiskey that will eventually be bourbon. Where with pot stills, you're dealing with a single pot, just like it says. So you pump in the beer into the pot, you heat it up, and then as it gets to temperature, about 175 degrees Fahrenheit, it'll start to distill. And then once you've removed all the alcohol that tastes pleasant, you shut it off and you pump it out, and you have to do it again.
Gotcha.
So those are that's like the main difference in terms of the mechanics of the two stills.
Gotcha. And so the column still, you're pumping the distiller's beer into the top of the column, right?
Correct.
And there's these plates in there. And why are there more than one plate in a column still? What do the plates do? Does that separate different temperature zones or something, or?
The big thing is that you need that sort of height and that sort of that number of plates to find that really consistent equilibrium. Uh-huh. Because one of my favorite things about column stills is what makes it so consistent is that you can have the exact same temperature of steam, the amount of volume of steam coming in the bottom, and the same flow rate of beer coming in from the top. And with that amount of plates, I can nail the exact same temperature of distillation every single time. And mm-hmm. it requires that many plates for that efficiency, because it'll slowly go down, and the concept is when it gets to that bottom plate, all the alcohol has been removed.
Sure.
Where if it was a shorter still, you'd have to have more heat from the bottom to strip all the alcohol off, and through that you're gonna pull a lot of unpleasant acetaldehydes and other ingredients that you don't necessarily want in your final product.
Gotcha. And so since you've got these vapors that are kind of floating around inside of this column, how do you do your cuts, right? Because for those of you who aren't familiar, when you do a distillation run, you have your head, which are your lighter compounds, your heart, which is your ethanol, and your tails, which are your heavier compounds. And you don't really want heads in your distillate when you're aging, and you might want a little bit of tails for esterification and stuff later, but you don't want all of that in there either. So how do you separate it out since it's all just kind of floating around in this column?
There's not really cuts like you do in pot stills, where what he's referring to is that as it's coming off the still, I'm tasting it along the way, and at the beginning there's those heads, and at the very end it starts to taste like dirty newspaper or wet dog, and those are how I recognize when to cut the run or when to start the hearts run. But with pot, there's no cuts like that.
With column, there's no cuts.
Yep. With a column, there's absolutely no cuts because you have that consistent temperature. The heads actually get vented off.
Okay.
It took me a really long time to get a real answer on this, even though it's so simple. I went to Kentucky and I talked to a bunch of guys, and it was like almost all bourbon is done through a column still. So because of that, a lot of them have no experience on pot stills. So like I'm asking these questions from the framework of somebody that's run pot stills, but for them it was an odd question. But I'm like, where did the heads go? I don't get it. Like, we're not making any cuts, but there's no solvent-like qualities coming on into the hearts. You set your condensers. So a condenser is the last part of the still before you get your white dog. So after it vaporizes and it's going through the column, it's a big cold tube, and in there is additional tubes, and it knocks that vapor down to liquid, and then it runs off. That's what you see coming off a still. So that condenser temp is actually really important because you want to set it at somewhere between 90 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And when you do that, the higher alcohols, which is like your solvent like acetones, they never actually condense. There's just little puffs of vapor coming off of the top of the condenser, and that's your heads. Mm-hmm. And tails just continue to get recycled in your doubler. It just sits in your doubler, and you're pumping new, we call that low wines. Mm-hmm. So what comes off the column is low wines. What comes off the doubler is high wines. So it's just, it keeps a steady water or a steady ethanol level, and it's just continue redistilling and redistilling, and that way tails never get in your final product.
Gotcha. And so it's very different with a pot still, because with the pot still, you actually have to, first the heads are coming off, and you have to decide, okay, I'm gonna cut it off here, and all of this stuff, we're not putting this stuff in a barrel, we're gonna set this stuff aside, and then you start to collect the hearts. Is that fair?
Yeah, so once the heads are gone, you start the hearts, and right. You can do it I do it by temperature. I'm looking at the vapor temp, but my main thing is by taste, because each fermentation is a little bit different. We strive for consistency on that front, but when it comes to fermentation, there's all these microorganisms in the air that differ depending on what season it is. So you're going to find some fluctuation there, where the column you're able to really like find that consistency even with those small varying degrees. But with pot, there's just...
Hey there, Bourbon Real Talk listeners and watchers. Randy Sullivan here. Wanted to take a quick break to tell you how you can support the channel. We've had a lot of people that have come into the Bourbon Real Talk family lately, and we're grateful for every one of you. But unlike a lot of other channels, we don't have a Patreon, and I don't allow anyone to sponsor the show. So what I do have, though, is some merchandise. So one of the things that I wanted to show you guys is we have Bourbon Real Talk Glencairns available for sale on our website. And great news, we actually have some wee Glens on their way. So we had wee Glens custom manufactured. They're half the size of a regular Glen, excellent for tasting. On the website, we also have candles, and they're more masculine scents. So this one's like leather. And these candles are manufactured by my daughter's candle company. She wanted to buy her own car, so we helped her start her own business. And she manufactured a line of masculine smelling candles for the Bourbon Real Talk family. The next thing that we have is kind of a little interesting gadget. This is a Glen lanyard. So basically, it goes around your neck like any other lanyard, but it's specifically designed to hold a Glen whiskey glass. And it allows you to go hands-free. So honestly, the first time I saw one of these, I thought it was a silly concept. Then someone gave me one. I used it at a bottle share. It was super efficient, truly made it a more enjoyable experience as I interacted with people. We also have these decorative storage boxes for your whiskey samples. So if you get involved in the whiskey community, you're gonna be given samples like this one. And one day you're gonna look up and you got little sample bottles sitting all over the place. It doesn't look that good. And so we manufactured these custom storage boxes. Those are available as well. And the creme de la creme of merch for Bourbon Real Talk is the American Whiskey Aroma Kit. So the story on this is I was doing reviews. People kept asking me, how do you learn how to break down the different flavors of a whiskey? And I had learned through a wine aroma kit, but I could not find a bourbon aroma kit that I liked. Most of them came in a cardboard box. The scents didn't always make sense for bourbon. Some of them would say they were for bourbon, but they had scents in there that were really more Scotch focused. And so my wife, who helped with the candle company, helped me curate this box. We crowdsourced the 36 scents that went in this through the whiskey community. And I probably went through about 350 different scents to find these 36. Interesting little tidbit, I've given one of these to the master distiller of a major legacy Kentucky distillery, and he reported back that he loves all the scents and that he uses it to train his sensory team, but I am not allowed to tell you what the distillery is, or it would probably ruin my relationship with them. So, if you saw any of this stuff, you want to support the channel, you can head on over to bourbonrealtalk.com/shop and pick something up. But if you just want to hang out here and learn, I'm totally happy with that as well. Just happy to have you as a listener.
In there where the column you're able to really like find that consistency even with those small varying degrees, but with pot there's just a much wider range.
Gotcha.
It also brings me to a good point that you mentioned, is efficiency. Whenever you have to stop your run on your pot still, and even though there's lots of alcohol left in there, but it's starting to taste gross, there's nothing you can really do. You can recycle that and get a little bit more off the next run, but with a pot still, you're losing about 20% of the efficiency.
Oh, wow.
So the exact same volume of beer going in, I'm gonna get 20% more final product just because
On a column than you would
on a column, just because you have to cut it off, where on the column you can just strip all the alcohol off and utilize it in
Right,
in a
because
better
it just
fashion.
keeps floating around in that column until it gets separated.
Exactly.
Right.
So we're talking, if you produce 4 barrels on a column, you get 1 extra barrel. And
So the next time you guys complain about how much a bottle of Treaty Oak costs, just understand that they are operating, most of the stuff they're selling now, at least everything that's in Ghost Hill, right?
everything that's Ghost Hill is currently pot
is current pot
Yeah.
still. Just understand there's not the efficiencies that the legacy distilleries in Kentucky have that have these, column stills that are multiple stories high that run almost 24 hours a day. They can produce things at a much cheaper cost per gallon than a craft producer that's using a pot still, which is much less efficient. But it does have an impact on the flavor of the distillate, right? I mean,
Totally.
I've observed there's a whole lot more flavor in a pot still distillate than there is in a column still distillate. Whether you like that flavor or not is a separate conversation to have. So what compounds do you end up with in your distillate on a pot still that you would not expect out of a column still?
Yeah, well, to an extent, it just depends how you run it. But at the end of the day, with the column still, you're gonna find a much cleaner product. I feel like corn really shines through better. Where that pot still, you deal with a lot heavier congeners and it's much oilier, and depending on how you heat it up, you're going to get more roasted chocolate, coffee notes because that beer still has some grain in it, and the steam that's touching the outside of that pot, it naturally starts to build up and burn a little bit. So you get a little bit of those roasted qualities.
Oh, okay.
Opposed to the column, which is all steam that's directly injected into it.
Right.
Much cleaner. It's typically a more lighter bodied product.
So basically, because the heat source in a column is steam, and the heat source in a pot still is almost a direct heat from what got put into the bottom of the basin, you can actually start to cook that distiller's beer to a certain extent, and maybe even caramelize it and burn it and throw off some coffee or roasted nut notes or something like that you wouldn't necessarily get on a column?
Yeah, that's just a theory that I have.
Okay.
Not very many people talk about that, but I mean, you run that pot still for a while, and you'll find that there's, at the bottom, it takes a lot of work to clean it off, and there's a lot of these burned marks. And naturally, if you see that, it's going through the Maillard reaction, and it's caramelizing and cooking, and that's such a delicate flavor that
any amount of it's going to affect
the tiniest
distillate.
amount is going to really showcase itself in the final product. So that's one thing I've noticed. I've noticed that on all pot stills when you're running any sort of whiskey that has particulates in it. So like, you obviously wouldn't get those notes as much in a single malt because they go through a filtering process where the beer that they use is devoid of all those
all the
solids.
grains. Yeah.
And that's why most Irish whiskey, most Scotch is all done
on a pot
still, because they didn't have the technologies back then of the column still, and it's also it runs a lot better.
It runs better for there. So basically what he's referring to is when you make a distiller's beer, so you grind up your grain and you cook it and then you ferment it, and then you got to decide, am I going to put all of it with the undissolved solids and everything into my still, or am I going to siphon off the juice and just put the juice in the still? And for malted barley and the way that they make whiskey in Scotland and Ireland, their fermenters have a bottom that almost looks like a colander. It's got holes in it, so they drain all of the juice off of the grain, right? And I think they do that in the cooker, and then they ferment off grain, and then they take the fermented juice and put it in the still. But there's not pieces of the husk and all of that stuff in it. But with bourbon, we grind up the grain and we put all of that through the entire process through the still. And so I would make the argument that historically, and part of the reason why bourbon tastes the way that it does and Scotch and Irish whiskey tastes the way that it does, is because of that very difference in the process. And because of that difference, it might make more sense to make malted barley on a pot still. Plus, pot stills tend to retain some more flavor from the grain. Malted barley is not a very flavorful grain compared to corn and rye and wheat. And so if you want there to be a lot of flavor in your whiskey, any flavor from the grain, and you're using malted barley, you probably need a pot still. But a column still might be better suited for whiskey. And if you use a pot still, just understand, it's gonna produce a great, big, bold flavor, very oily, viscous whiskey. It's gonna completely coat your palate. It's gonna have a super long finish. And if you're not a fan of those flavors, it's going to be shocking to you. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we have been lucky enough that here at Treaty Oak, they have Distillate, that they've made their whiskey from both the pot still and the column still. And we have White Dog, and White Dog is how you refer to a whiskey that's just come off the still, but has not been aged yet because it's still clear. It looks like water, but it's not. And we are going to try these together. So tell us what we got in front of us.
Yeah, so in our hands we have the pot still.
Mm-hmm.
So this is 125 proof.
Nope, that's a column. The column's on the outside.
We have ours flipped.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
I've got the pot on the inside.
You can't.
That's how shockingly different they are.
We didn't even need to label them.
We don't need to label them.
We should have communicated better on it.
Yes.
Which was my fault.
No, it's my bad. All right, so we've got, I've got the column still in my hand.
Now I have the pot.
And to me, this, like, everyone always laughs because I can drink like a white dog, or I can drink even a moonshine, and if it's a good moonshine, I'm like, tastes like cotton candy to me. Like, it's just sweet, and people are like, no, it tastes like fire, and I'm like, no, but I also find it interesting that that with your column still whiskeys, you have a lower barrel entry proof. Is that the case?
No, it fluctuates depending on the run and the...
You taste it and you decide what your barrel entry proof will be? Yeah. So a lower barrel entry proof is likely to produce more flavor in the final bottled product because the water that's in the distillate that's being aged in the barrel has time to interact with the barrel. And ethanol tends to pull different compounds out of the barrel than water does. So if you water it down and you're gonna have a lower proof product in the bottle, you actually add less like purified water at the end when you're proofing down than you would if you had started at a higher proof. It's also way more expensive to barrel at a lower barrel entry proof because you have to have more barrels, which means you have to have more barrel warehouse space and all of that stuff. So if you always go in at the maximum legal limit and then you proof down from there, that's the most financially efficient way, but it may not be the most flavorful way because you end up drinking a lot of your bottle that never interacted with the barrel. And so it's very respectable that Treaty Oak takes the time to taste the distillate and say, do we need more flavor in the end out of this one, or is this one flavorful enough that we can do what's financially efficient? And then they adjust it from there.
I love the way you describe that. A lot of people explain it other ways. I think that's the clearest and most concise way, and just that the less water you have to add on the back end, the less dilution you're gonna see.
Wow. So on the palate, I don't know. I mean, it's very sweet. It's got a punchy fruit note.
Mm-hmm. I get a lot of like dry sour cherry. On our white dog.
I can see that.
And I think part of that is the wheat has a lot of creaminess to it from this column.
Okay.
And because it's this like creamy corn, and then there's that dark fruit of the cherries. But overall, it's very light-bodied. Yeah. A little bit viscous, but
clean.
But very clean.
It feels clean. Yeah, it's a little like one of those. You know the chocolate-covered cherries that you get at Valentine's Day?
The ones with the like pink
filling in them? With the pink filling. It tastes a little bit like that without the chocolate, I would say. Okay, so let's move over to this pot still. Much larger, bolder nose. Just like shockingly different. Wow. Wow.
See what I'm talking about with the chocolate roasted notes?
Yeah, this tastes more like if you took that chocolate cherry and then you turned that into a reduction sauce. Yeah. Right? It's like, it's so concentrated. But there's definitely a chocolatey note, almost a roasted coffee note.
Mm-hmm. I get a lot more of the malt through the pot as well. It has that, which I like. Often malt is associated with those chocolate notes because a lot of times you see chocolate malts in beer making and also coming into the whiskey arena.
And for those of you at home, a chocolate malt is basically a malted barley that they roast the grain before they mill it. And depending on how much roasting it goes through, the darker the roasting, the more dark chocolate and coffee notes start to come out on that. And they do the same thing with rye. So you'll see a chocolate malted rye. You'll see, a darker chocolate malted barley. There's things that you can do during the toasting process that can bring out other flavors, right? But no, this is
Or
beautiful.
you just burn it on the bottom of your pot
Or you
still.
burn it on the bottom of your pot still.
It's a little bit cheaper.
It's a little bit cheaper and part of the process, so it's more organic. So is there anything else you want to add for the people?
No, I mean, people so often talk about how pot stills are so much more romantic and artistic, and I at one point was in agreement, and that was until we got a column still, and I've realized just how much more controls and honestly how much more artistic that you can be on it, because you just have so many more levers that you can pull. So I've fallen in love with our column still, and we're going to continue using the pot still, and it's going to become entirely separate expressions because that's really what they are.
That's really what they are.
They're totally different products with the exact same mash bill, exact same grains, but just depends on what still we want to run it through.
Well, Bourbon Real Talk wants to thank Treaty Oak for having us out and giving us this educational bit of information. You can go to Facebook, Instagram, /Treaty Oak. They got a lot of great outdoor events here, socially distanced. It's a place that you can go and safely have a good time with your entire family. There's a playground for the kids, and I'm really excited about their products. Widely distributed. You can even find their products online. I forget, he's the distiller, so he probably doesn't know the name of the company.
Thanks for saving me on that one.
Yeah, I'm trying to save him because I looked at his eyes and he's like, I don't do that part, calm down. But no, you can find their products online for sale. There's a company that will ship the products to you, so just search for Treaty Oak online. And if you want more information about Bourbon Real Talk, you can find that at bourbonrealtalk.com, Facebook and Instagram, and YouTube /Bourbon Real Talk. We'd love it if you'd subscribe, like, review, and comment. And always remember that this channel is about bringing people together through bourbon. Unfortunately, in 2014, I lost my brother to suicide, who was a veteran. He had PTSD, he was badly addicted to painkillers, and I realized that there's a lot of people out here who feel lonely and separated from those around them. And this channel is about using the connective power of bourbon to bring people together. I see a lot of division and separation in this world today, and I see a lot of divided people showing hate to one another online, and I figure if strangers can hate each other online, I can love them. So if you woke up this morning and you were unsure whether or not anyone loved you, just know that I love you. And I'll see you next time on Bourbon Real Talk.